What is going on, YouTube? Colonel here and welcome back to the channel. I know it's weird, usually you guys don't see my model on YouTube, but I kind of want to change things up a bit and do a bit more often where you guys can see me a bit more when we do things like reactions. So what are we going to be getting into today? Well, a fellow content creator by the name of Cathy made a video talking about their biggest wishes for the NGS loot system. And man, oh man, one thing that you hear all the time when it comes to PSO2 is the loot's not good enough. We need better loot, right? So while I don't disagree with that, I also have context of what PSO has been for a very long time. Now, I know there's some people who are gonna be like, oh, here we go again. Grandpa's talking about back in the day, but I want to give context. There's a lot of new players that are playing the game that have only played the game since the launch of NGS. Didn't really play base game, or only played base game, but since the launch of Global, not JP, which for those who played during JP will know, the game changed a drastic amount from what we know as episode 1 or 2, even up to 3 in base game in JP, versus what we got when Global released. The game was very, very different. And through that time, there was iteration on gearing, iteration on the loot system, and I wanted to talk about all of those things here because it's easy for us to ask for specific things or for us to look at things from, you know, rose tinted glasses gets used a lot, unfortunately, and it's hard to not default to that specific type or the phrasing, but it's easy to look at things of the past fondly without realizing what they truly were when we break them down. And that's what this video is here to do. I want to break down a lot of these concepts that we had of gearing and of loot and things like that in base PSO2, which kind of explains a lot of why we have gearing that we have today when it comes to loot and NGS, and things that I honestly think would realistically help out the loot system. Now, a couple of things here as prerequisites. One, Cathy and I are going to disagree on quite a few things. That's just the nature of the beast when you talk about opinions. That does not mean that I dislike this individual whatsoever. Honestly, I like their video format a lot. They do a really, really good job. I'm pretty jealous of the editing. I can't put that much time into it. I've tried. It burns me out, and I end up not wanting to make videos, which has happened recently on the channel. So I'm trying to get back into it. So I want to find my own sort of style, and I like this opinion-based sort of thing a bit more, as a bit more freeform. Two, this video is not going to be short. My video, at least, my reaction, because I'm going to give you guys not only what I think are good ideas when it comes to loot, but I also want to give you guys a retrospective of what actually happened during that time frame and how easy it was for us to just overlook it at the time because we were so used to it. There were certain things that were just auto do this, this, and this, and realistically at the time you just didn't realize what was happening because you were so used to the daily grind, so to speak. You just did specific things over and over and it didn't really matter too much. And finally, I want no ill will to go towards this individual. Like I said beforehand, we are going to disagree on certain things. I don't think they put out this video to be a contrarian. I'm not making this video to be a contrarian. I just want to make sure that everyone has an active and updated set of information from my perspective, because you guys like to hear my takes on a lot of these things. So we're gonna go ahead and go over it. I'm gonna leave a link in the video description to not only Cathy's video, but I also want to leave a link to my good pal Criticaster's video, which is what prompted me to make this video in the first place. Crit also made a reaction to this video, so in case you're curious of his opinion that went up a little while ago, feel free to check that out. And Cathy's video is actually done really, really well, so feel free to toss him a sub or a like on the video. That'd be super awesome. And if at the very least, if you watch my video and you're not going to watch theirs, at the very least hop over, toss them a like, maybe toss a comment. It does help out the algorithm a lot. All right, let's go ahead and jump into this. Give me just one sec. All right, so my biggest wish for NGS version 2 update PSO opinion. Just a heads up, I've tried recording this video a couple of times and just didn't like how I explain things. Did give some context to how this video was going to work out, so I went ahead and I'm just going to redo this from the start and kind of warn you guys ahead of time because I know this video is going to be long because I've tried it a few times. Also, we did also record a reaction to this over on Twitch. I'm gonna go ahead and leave that highlight up, that way you guys can see like just my gut reaction to a lot of things, because I didn't know the entire video at the time, so it does, you know, change up a little bit of how I feel, but not exactly. But I did kind of call this video almost immediately as I started hearing it and saw the background for it. So just because it's I mean, as creators, you start to see a lot of the same things, and honestly, a lot of what Cathy feels is a lot of what most of you guys mimic. So I think I'm gonna leave it like this. I don't know why I like this whenever I'm doing reactions. I like making sure you guys can see the person's name and their video and things like that. It might help if I had this set properly for us too. There we go.
You know, there is this saying. You never know what you have until you lose it. This saying has been stuck in my head for the past few weeks. I've been playing some PSO2 Classic, trying to retrace some steps I did on JP servers that I've never done on global servers.
So just for clarity, I'm not sure how much Cathy played on JP, but for my own, like, what my history is with JP, I played back in the very tail end of episode 3 and played through JP from episode 3 all the way through episode 6 of JP, going into global, and played consistently from beta and global all the way till we currently have now an NGS. So played a lot. I think my first upload on YouTube was I want to say 5 years ago, maybe. Yeah, we'd have to go back and double check and see, but maybe I'll toss it up on screen in editing.
But playing the game again reminded me of how much worse the loot in New Genesis is. In today's
I'm gonna wait on that
episode of PS Opinion, I'd like to discuss that.
So we're going to talk about it in a minute, but the looting is almost exactly the same, and I'm going to explain how. There's like 1 or 2 key differences, but it's almost exactly the same.
Let's lay down the groundwork first. In PSO2 Classic, the process of attaching desired augments onto your gear was much more convoluted than it is in New Genesis.
A big part of gearing in base game is affix based. That's where most of your gearing, or most of the looting in the system, came from.
Items can drop with random augments attached to them, and if you want to move them to a
Crack 3,
item,
dude. Shiva
a
Glare.
little bit of work and
Good
mental
stuff.
gymnastics. You can't simply just pull out one augment from a weapon or unit and move it to the next. You have to use fodders to create better fodders, and once you have assembled the perfect fodder items, you can start attaching them to the item you want. It is a convoluted system that has many mechanics under the hood, which the game simply doesn't teach you about. But the system was actually kind of genius because it allowed every piece of loot to be worth something, depending. Okay,
so this. Oh, I'm gonna let this finish up.
Augments attached to it. A 1-star unit could still be your most valuable drop in a quest, simply because it dropped with a desired augment with a high slot amount. In New Genesis, all of the value is pushed onto the augment capsule, and it makes weapons and units worthless.
So let's take a step back here really quick. Let me make sure. Okay, we're gonna leave it paused where we're at the moment. So affixing and augmenting. This was called convoluted. So here's my issue with affixing / augmenting in base PSO2. It was not only convoluted, it was convoluted and complicated. You're probably thinking, well, you're splitting hairs at this point, right? Well, not exactly. Let's give an example of something convoluted. The Kingdom Hearts storyline is convoluted. It's not complicated. Once you understand it, it's pretty much the same across the board. There's a basis of how things work. There's an overall plan of what's trying to happen, and that's what they're doing, right? Like that makes sense once you understand it. There's just so many hoops you go through to understand it. It's ridiculous. Affixing is both convoluted and complicated. Once you understand it, you still need to have a very deep knowledge of all of the intricacies of how it works to be able to then put that knowledge you've learned to use. So I'm going to explain really quickly basic affixing, which people who know about this are probably thinking, holy crap, dude, this is going to take way too long. I'm going to do my best to do this as short as possible. So for those who don't know how affixing works, let's take the idea of an augment you're trying to move from one piece of gear to the next, right? So the words that were used are fodder, very commonly used. But the way affixing works out is you have your end piece that you're trying to put an augment on, and you have what they call the fodder pieces. The fodder pieces are what's used in the recipe to then move those augments over onto the end piece. So when you add in a fodder and an end piece, it then looks at all the augments across the board. It uses up the quote fodder, and then it gives you out what augments can be moved onto your end piece with a percentage chance. Let's use might for an example. Let's say we have a sword. We're trying to put might 3 on it. We'll use that. Now, I don't remember the exact percentages because yes, there were different percentages and different ways to move things based on different augments. So it got a little complicated there, but let's just say it was a base chance of like 50%. If we were to use 1 might 3, and you're thinking 1 might 3, okay, well, you have a piece of gear with might 3 on it, and then you have your end piece that doesn't have might 3. It has like just some other augments on them. You're going to hear the word junk augment used very commonly. That's just an augment that's easy to affix onto your gear that you don't need to, like, you don't really care too much about. The thing about gear in base PSO2 was that augments had to be slotted in. There were no empty slots like they are in NGS. You had to slot in an augment to make sure that it retained that number of augment slots. And then to be able to augment something, it had to have at least the same number or more augment slots to be used as fodder for your end piece, meaning that if I was augmenting might 3 onto a sword that had 3 slots on it, that means that I had to have 3 slots minimum on my fodder, the piece that had might 3 on it as well. That's why the price of certain augments would go up in price depending upon the augment slots that they actually had. For example, that she showed, Cathy showed, I think it was Ark's Fever on a 6 slot unit was like 16 mil. If you were to look for it on, like, say, a 1 slot unit, it would be substantially cheaper, but keep in mind you would only be able to use that on another 1 slot unit. So all of that aside, basically you'd have your fodder, you'd have the augment you want to move over to your actual piece, and then you had a percent chance for it to go through. Now, let's say that percent chance is like 50%, right? Now, you can increase that with, percent increasing items. You also can technically add another fodder with the same augment, which would increase its chances. This is where I said that the percentages would change up depending upon what you did. This was one way to increase the percentage chance for might 3. Now, so you have 2 might 3s in your fodders and then just the end piece. Now, might 3 has a better chance of moving over. Well, you move it over onto that piece of gear, and now let's say, oh, I want to go ahead and add, I don't know, stamina 3 or something like that. Moves over the same way, but you notice that, oh, well, now this is my might 3 only has a 50% chance of applying, but it's already on the piece of gear that I want it on. Well, that was the issue with augmenting, was that you would have to augment every step of the way, meaning that if you were adding in more augments with different fodders that didn't have what you already were trying to put on there, you would then need to add more of that fodder in. So let's say, for example, I wanted to move over might 3 and stamina 3. I would have to have 2 fodder with might 3, 2 fodder with stamina 3, and then the end result. Or I could have 2 fodder that each had might 3 and stamina 3 on it, which caused people to build fodder a lot of time to then create their end result piece. You see how a lot of this now, we're starting to get more complex, and we've only gone into like 2 augment slots. Weapons and units went up to 6. I'm sorry, went up to 8. So you can understand how these would get very complicated. I think I melted my chat's brain over showing them how I had to make Guardian Soul, which was one of the best souls in base PSO2, and the chart that you had to go through and all of the different things. It was absolutely insane, and the percentage chances. So yeah, it was a lot. This is what I mean, like, it was a complicated system that a lot of people just did not interact with, and we're going to talk more about that in a little bit here. Remember when I said this was going to be a long video? It's 1 minute and 47 seconds in. This video is 13 minutes long. I wasn't kidding.
Because of this, the auto sell feature had to be implemented, which basically removes most of the loot from the game, and makes the loot tables feel hollow.
Yeah, I mean, you didn't really need a lot of the unit or weapons to drop, and made it so it was actually a little bit easier. And again, this is going to be more about that whole, like, the system was very similar, but we're going to talk about it in a second.
And the best part about PSO2 affixing was that offensive augments offered so little power that the system wasn't mandatory. Only hardcore players would frown on you for not affixing your gear, but that's just a loud minority of players. The fact that...
So this is just factually incorrect. 2 things are off here, and maybe this was just someone's experience, I don't know, but consistently in my experiences and experiences of others I've talked with, as well as seen on other streams and other YouTube videos and things like that, hardcore players, quote unquote, knew affixing sucked. We all knew it. No one was upset at anyone for not affixing. It was pretty common that you would expect people to be one of two categories. Honestly, one of 3 categories. A third category was the one that people were mostly concerned with. Either you were someone who set up your own gear and augmented your own gear, so affixed your own gear up and had it set up, or you were someone who just used whatever dropped or whatever came on that piece of gear by default. This was changed up a little bit when a different type of augment came out, which she's going to talk about a little bit later in the video, and we'll talk about it then. but a lot of times gear would drop with semi-decent augments already, where it would be more difficult for you to then augment it yourself with the actual proper augments that you want, and get a better setup going than what it actually dropped with. So it was better sometimes just to take what it dropped with and then move forward. What most hardcore quote unquote players were looking for you to do was just have the current weapon, have it at max upgrade, have the potential unlocked, and have it be the proper element. And then have your units upgraded and set up as well. That's mostly it. No one was really looking for you guys to actually, or no one was looking for anyone to augment their gear, because most of the time, a lot of hardcore players, quote unquote, were hoping you didn't, so you would buy the gear that they would augment for you to then move on to your gear. So that wasn't a thing. This was a common misconception I heard all the time. And then when we actually researched it, we found that people weren't looking at this. The biggest issue, and the thing that people really frowned upon, was that players very commonly just didn't do either of those things. Because base PSO2 didn't have a battle power requirement, the only gating was getting to the appropriate level to do the piece of content. People would go in with whatever weapon. A lot of times just a random weapon that would have dropped, when realistically there should have been a weapon that they were, building up towards or getting resources for, and it was completely ignored. And then go in with whatever units and things weren't upgraded. That's realistically where people started to get like irritated, where players just weren't actually gearing. And on top of that, there's a specific affixing system that we got moving into episode 6 that was even more so incredibly powerful. A very common misconception was that base or just random stats weren't very strong, but the damage formula actually interacted with stats from your units differently than it would interact with stats from, say, like your skill tree. So stats from your units and your gear mattered a lot more than stats from your skill tree. Not saying that, your gear was all based on your augments. Yes, most of your power was within using the right weapon, having the right element, having the potential unlocked, but there was still a good chunk of power that came from having the right augments set up on there as well and getting enough power out of those.
That PSO2 augmenting offered very little power also helped with paid augments.
Yes, that's just, again, that wasn't the case. People just didn't want, I mean, realistically, and I skipped over this, because of how complicated the augmenting system was, players just didn't want to do it. They didn't want to. Flat out just didn't want to deal with it. People just said, you know what, this is too complicated. Either I pay someone else to do it, or I don't bother with it because I can get enough power outside of that.
Grand precision was best in slot, but it really wasn't that important to have. Meanwhile in NGS, if you don't have ADI augments on all 4 of your items, you're missing out a lot of overall damage.
So this is probably the worst comparison to make, right? You're looking at Deft Melra, which is 3% melee and range damage, and 2.75% potency floor, as nearly a 2% damage increase over Melra Dual. Yes, absolutely, it's going to be almost a 2% damage increase. You didn't even compare this to accurate what you would accurately put in its slot place. You're looking at a 3% versus a 2.7% augment. Notice we didn't even this is where I'm like, we want to make sure we give proper context, right? Because we're comparing one of the strongest augments that's available currently in the actual setup to one of the cheapest, weakest augments that you can use as a replacement. It wasn't even really compared to, like, let's say Tech 4, which is also extraordinarily cheap. What I would compare this to would be something like Alt Secreta, which is 2.5, 2.5. That would be more of like a realistic comparison of something you would actively swap out, right? Now, granted, in the different augment setups you do, you can find that you're going to get different amounts of power. In my previous video that I tried to record for this, I actually went over onto my alt and showed you guys its gear and showed you how you actively can get quite a bit of damage for not that much money spent. I think I set up my entire alt gear for less than 7 mil, which seems expensive, but that's less than the cost of like the new cat emote. So players always say fashion over gear. I spent less on my gear than some people spend on one piece of fashion or one emote. So it's not that difficult to set up, and it's something that I'm going to show you guys in a different video where I show, how to gauge how much power you should be going for based on how much money you're going to be putting into this. But this is a very deceptive comparison. Yes, absolutely, these are going to be a pretty massive DPS difference. They're not even in the same ballpark.
Items, you're missing out a lot of overall damage. This is because all damage increasing augments are multiplicative in New Genesis. So, the more damage augments you have, the more they snowball out of control. This punishes players for using non-offensive augments like Dreadkeeper, which are popular among the casual crowd.
Again, I don't understand this comparison either. Dreadkeeper 4, players use this, and a lot of times when it's popular, it's expensive. So it's not even really worth use here. So keep in mind these quote expensive augments to use, right? So the Addy Deft Mells and things like that, those are one capsule, 100% chance. Something like, let's say, Dreadkeeper. Dreadkeeper's one capsule at like 8% chance, meaning you would need 10 of them, meaning that at the time before like the events, like, okay, so granted the events did mess with prices a little bit and the recent announcements did mess with prices as well, but before the events, before the price changes and all of those sorts of things, Dreadkeeper getting 10 of these was, I want to say, maybe a third of the cost of getting one capsule at 100%, which, yeah, it's a third of the cost, but you're looking at the best in slot capsule was maybe 4 mil, and 10 Dreadkeepers was going to run you about 1.3, almost 1.5 mil. And even then, this was actually optimal to pick up in some cases that you needed extra HP and PP for one slot. So this wasn't even a situation where Dreadkeeper was more of the casual choice. It's still correct to use in some situations. It's just about knowing what the proper augment is to use given what you have access to. This is, and again, no disrespect to Cathy, but this is really deceptive for players who don't understand the augmenting system. You can get a lot of damage even going the casual option. You just have to go to the right casual choice. Even building tanky, there's a proper way to do it without losing a ton of damage, which is very common. I see a lot of players do. A good example of someone who does this correctly is my good friend Caro, who builds his character more tanky, but he doesn't lose a ton of damage behind it. He still maintains a good chunk of damage even while building tanky, which you absolutely can do.
Divide in DPS between casuals and hardcore players. In PSO2, most of the power came from the weapon of choice, and getting some of the top weapons wasn't that difficult. The key difference between a casual and hardcore player was in skill. Now it's skill and the depth of your purse.
It's not. It's still just skill. In base PSO2, a player could realistically carry a full 12-man lobby by themselves. I've done it on multiple occasions. Just augmenting properly, you absolutely would destroy everyone around you. Like, you did insane amounts of damage. I, as an Etwal, as technically the lowest DPS Scion class, out DPS'd other Scion classes on more than one occasion. That's not a flex. That is literally just being honest. My friends absolutely killed it, and they did much better than I did, and that happened all the time. But with just against versus just random people, absolutely killed it. So that's not the case at all. It's still mostly the same. Actually, if anything, the gap is a little bit less because realistically, you can get so much power for so little cost. Most of what's happening is just player ignorance, unfortunately. People don't realize how much power you can actually get. And I'm always told that people are surprised when they look at my alt characters and like, how much potency do you have? How much damage do you have? Like, I didn't spend that much on this character. It was very cheap.
I get it though. PSO2's affixing system was more complicated than it had to be, and many people don't miss the system at all.
No.
I personally believe simply making the system more easier to understand would have been better than getting rid of it entirely. But
Debatable.
I don't think going back to it now is possible anymore. So
We
let's
agree
work
there.
with what we have.
And keep in mind, part of the complication with base PSO2's augmenting system was there was way too much to think about for every single piece of loot. Every piece of loot had the potential to be worth something, meaning that you had to pay attention to everything that dropped. And they dropped a lot of stuff. So gearing or properly sorting out loot, if you didn't really know about it, was an absolute nightmare. Understanding which augments were worth money versus which ones weren't was absolutely insane. And I guarantee you there were tons and tons of pieces of gear that people either turned into X cubes or they just simply left on the ground or just vendored and didn't realize might have been worth millions.
Can we improve the loot? Well, first of all, the easiest way would be to improve the preset skills system. It's been 2 years, and it's still the same 3 different fixa skills that drop at an abysmally low rate.
This does need to be
the point
improved.
where if you turn auto sell on, you might forget that enemies even have weapons and units in their loot tables at all.
You still see all the Meseta and everything drops. That's not really true.
Making preset skills more common, being able to level them up, being able to transfer them across weapon series, as well as add new skills for more variety.
So this is a little bit hopium. So I do agree higher drop rates would be nice. That definitely is something that I've always said it needs to be a thing, because or the fact that you can't get preset skills realistically on the gear or the weapon that you're looking for is really annoying. So if they don't change anything else, this is like bare minimum, please. Like, make this more of a thing. Leveling up preset skills. This is a very dangerous choice because it depends on how you choose to level up preset skills. Is it materials based or is it other preset skills based, right? At what point does it become more cost effective to have a level 1 of a preset skill and level it up to level 5 versus buying the level 5 outright? If you're someone who can farm the resources, eventually you can also make the money. So you can use the money to skip the process, but then it then makes, that top end drop that may have dropped worth much less for you, which I personally believe something shouldn't be 100 mil, 200 mil for a weapon or something along those lines. Realistically, upwards of like 30 mil should be the most that anything costs. But as it stands, if a weapon by itself without a preset skill is worth 30 mil, there is no way in hell I'm selling it for anything less than double that if I get a good preset skill at max level. If I get a Fatale 5 or a Termina 5 on a Gunblaze, you better believe I'm selling that for what it's worth. It's not a situation of just gouging the price. It's a situation of people pay that amount to get a hold of that weapon. Then on the opposite end, if we make it so it's easier to level these up, those higher level drops then feel worse and players make less money because they're not worth it as much. You just get to kind of skip the grind a little bit. Transfer across different weapon series. I sort of agreed with this to an extent, but you have to keep in mind that if this is possible, you then just make certain preset skills obsolete. Getting a preset skill on a gear or on a piece of gear becomes so incredibly easy because there's so much loot that drops with preset skills all over it that it really wouldn't matter. Think about seasonal weapons, how often those drop whenever we have boosts or bonuses to preset skills. Think about all the prim swords, all of the crappy weapons that drop all the time that we don't even pay any attention to, that drop with high preset skills that are always irritating. Yeah, it'd be great to be able to see that and have it be useful for a second, but once everyone just gets the preset skill they need, they become useless again because the price of those preset skills will be brought down by the fact that they're so readily available to everyone. The example I always use is look at the cost of the the camos that came out with the Newson plant. Those camos dropped so often. At first they were worth a ton of money, they plummeted within a day. They were worthless in a day itself, and they're still mostly worthless. So while yes, at first this would be awesome, it would just become another thing that we would vendor. So I propose instead transfer across the same weapon series. If I get a knuckle with like a Fatale 3 or a Fatale 5, but I'm a Soaring Blade main, that's the worst feeling if I can't sell it, or if anything along those lines, right? Because we did move to a situation where we had weapons we couldn't sell. So the cool thing would be to be able to go ahead and take that augment or take that preset skill and move it onto a weapon that I can use. I feel like that's a fair ask. Basically, higher drop rates and across the same weapon category would be a fair ask. Different preset skills. So it'd be cool if we had these, yes, but this provides the illusion of choice. Either it's going to go one of two directions. Either there's just going to be a better preset skill that you'll use, or it's going to force the use of multiple weapons depending upon certain situations, which players already don't want to build a single weapon and have it get completely overwritten as it is. People already complain about having to build an extra weapon when new content comes out that their old weapon's not useful. You know how many people cried about needing to make a new weapon after Kaiser because how much time and effort it took to make that weapon? It's going to be insane. People still want to use Kaiser. People are like, oh, holding on to Kaiser Enjoyer. Put that weapon away, please. So while this is kind of cool of an idea that'd be fun, I can't see a situation where people wouldn't still complain about this.
Would go a long way in making this system feel more like a proper weapon customization system. A few preset skills I can pull out of thin air would restore a lot of the flair older fantasies.
And this is exactly what I'm talking about. So Fixa enemy hunter improves damage against specific enemy types. Fixa element improves damage against enemy weak to specific elements. This just means that you would need to have a Fixa element on every single elemental weapon that drops to make it worth it. And then you would need to have multiple different weapons for different enemy types to optimize it. This would literally only make it worse for realistically for optimized players. Anyone else would just have a general weapon and that's all they would use. So this would be fairly annoying, unfortunately. Flavor wise, it's cool, but in practice, like, so like this is something that I would expect from like a solo game. It'd be cool, right? Because your experience doesn't have to hinder anyone else's experience and you can optimize as much as you want. But in the world of an MMO, your experience directly ties in with everyone else's experience around you, right? You're affecting everyone else's experience. So they would then need to tailor quest types to this as well, right? So imagine we fight an enemy or we fight a quest type where there are dolls and then altars as well. Well, now my weapon's only effective against one half of them. Do I need 2 weapons? Do I have to use a generalistic weapon? Do I need one of each of those weapons and a generalistic weapon for the different quest types? And then if that's the case, how much more damage is it? Is it enough to make me want to make 3 different weapons? These are all questions that have to be answered in those situations. And if it is enough to make me want to make 3 different weapons, well, now you've tripled my work with 3 different weapons. And if it's not, then what's the point?
Star games had. These would be stronger than Fixa attack, but come at a cost of only buffing power against one enemy race.
Fixa attack is the weakest Fixa of all of them. I assume they just mean it'd be stronger, like Fixa attack wouldn't be a better choice versus it, but yeah, that doesn't really say much. They all the other Fixas do damage as well, so Fixa attack's just general damage.
You could also have elemental Fixa that boosts damage against enemies weak to certain elements. For example, Fixa Light or Fixa Dolls Hunter would go hand in hand with Neo's Justitian series.
That would literally only work with Aegis? Yeah, pretty much Aegis.
Adding more preset
Or just Dark Falls in general.
skills does sound like RNG hell, so the system would need to be more flexible. Being able to level them up at a heavy material cost, or transfer them across weapon series would be necessary additions to the system. This would immediately make all those prim swords, with preset skills on them, way more valuable.
Here's the thing. It would make them necessary. Because of how RNG hell the gear would be, and you would have to be looking through all of this gear now, so you would actually have to actively paying attention to everything that drops, because everything could be useful with all of the fixes, right? So no more just farming easily and then just making money. You have to pay attention to all of this. You then also, on top of that, now have to go through the RNG hell that is sorting through all of this, finding out what's worth anything, and then if we find proper combinations, certain things are just gonna be worthless, right? Keep in mind, at the start of NGS, when Fix Attack was the thing, we didn't have crit chance, we didn't have crit damage, they just weren't enough. I mean, granted, there was like one setup where you did use crit chance, but that's besides the point. But it was all Fix Attack, and everything else was almost virtually worthless comparatively. Then we moved into a meta where Fix a Fatale became the thing, and then Fix Attack we learned was one of the weakest options you could go for, and then that became virtually worthless. Now we're in a meta where it's getting to a point where Termina and Fatale are very, very close, and guess what? Fixa Attack is almost worthless now. So what ended up happening is we would find the combination of what's useful versus what's not, and then those items would be worth something, and everything else would be worthless, and if those items are too easy to acquire, they wouldn't be worth a ton. You would just have to get a hold of them. Once you get them, you're done. Then that would cause those items to then depreciate because there's so many items now that you actually have that are useful. Those prices would go down, and then everything else would go down, just creating an overflow of items that we don't make any use for. People would end up vendoring them anyway. So it's, you create a problem, then have to create a solution for. So I think it'd be cool to have the idea of more fixes. The problem is it's very difficult to add in another fixa that isn't just damage, right? Because the other two you mentioned were just damage. Nothing changed about how the class played or what was going on. So realistically speaking, there's always going to be a right choice. And the reality is that either you choose the right choice or you choose what's fun. Sometimes they're both the same thing, not always the case. And a lot of times, in most cases, what's fun, or if what's fun isn't the right choice, that just causes people to be disgruntled. So then you would create a divide there.
A different solution to the problem could be something akin to how Phantasy Star Nova handled it.
For the record, I loved how Phantasy Star Nova did this.
In that game, instead of farming for gear, you were farming for materials that you then used in order to craft weapons, units, and augments. A change like this would make the auto-sell feature obsolete and material storage more mandatory, so SEGA would probably feel more forced to include it in the premium set or as a free.
This is 110% hopium. They would never consider this. If they were going to consider this, it would have been considered a much long time ago, perfectly honest. So maybe I'll eat my words, right? Maybe they will do this, but this wouldn't cause it. They wouldn't give us another problem to solve with material storage and then make less money from it. The reason why is material storage is worth star gems. Star gems, when you run out of them, is the worst currency to buy. So if you ever have to buy star gems, that's the most money that they can make. Star gem purchasing is a trap. So I would love for them to include it, but this is 100% hopium.
Free feature. But this isn't necessarily why I love the way Phantasy Star Nova handled.
If anything, it would make things worse, actually, because then players who didn't have premium or didn't have material storage or couldn't afford material storage or didn't pay enough in star gems for material storage, basically they didn't make enough star gems to be able to afford material storage, would then end up having to use extra characters as their storage, and their storage would be much worse.
Loot. In Phantasy Star Nova, augments were visual add-ons which you attach onto your weapon and could
This
move
is
them
so cool,
around
by the
and
way.
change their angle. If you gave a weapon an elemental core, it even changed its photon color. It was truly incredible. It actually felt like you're building a unique weapon.
It did. It reminds me a lot of World of Warcraft's. It's their old system they used to use in Legion. It's actually one of my favorite expansions. What was it? The artifact weapons. Those were awesome. Legendary weapons they actually use. Super, super cool. Here's the problem. So one, I mean, the photon color just changed a little light on your weapon, which, I mean, what, Universe did the same thing with elements. So nothing too crazy there. And this is super cool, right? But my concern comes in here. What happens when a new expansion comes out? What happens when a new weapon comes out? Is it a situation where we're building on the same weapon all the time? Is this a situation where we are getting a new weapon at the start of each upgrade path, right? When do we switch out these weapons? How do they look? How do we decide how they look? If a new weapon comes out and the cosmetics suck, right? Like, where does that put camos? How do camos end up interacting with the system? So these are all questions that have to get answered if we were to go with something like this. Now, granted, they're not proposing that this is the case of what we should do. This is just why this system works in the game that it works in and why it would be such an issue outside of that game itself. Well, I would love this and I wouldn't care to build up a new weapon every single patch, because I basically do every time it comes out. I love for an excuse to basically make a new weapon, right? Like, it hurts the wallet, but moving on to a new piece of gear, getting that bonus, getting that +1 is why I play MMOs in the first place. That's where I find my fun. But a lot of people don't want to do that. People barely want to switch off their weapons now as it is. And this, depending upon how it was implemented, how it would be implemented, would be a huge issue for them.
A unique weapon. The biggest strength of PSO2 was always being able to express yourself through your character.
Oh, and also, like, if that was the case for weapons, then what would the point of any other weapon in the game be? I guess we would just get rid of all other weapons and it would just be like materials, I guess, in that case.
Also, the combat is pretty great.
It is.
So why not
We
go
agree
a step
there.
further and allow us to express ourselves through our weapons as well? I would also love to see a return of S-grade augments. Damage multipliers that have conditions, or change how certain aspects of your class behave, go a long way in terms of weapon customizability. All of the augments in NGS are unconditional, and for the...
So this is why I said that the augment system that existed in base PSO2 had so much strength in it. So yes, individual augments, if you look at them on their own, were pretty weak. But when you combine them all together, ended up giving you a pretty powerful piece of gear because of how it interacted with the damage formula. Now, S-grade augments took that power and skyrocketed it. It changed up how some classes even played. It made certain weapons have certain effects that it absolutely needed. It added in and covered the weaknesses of certain classes. Try playing Bouncer as a Soaring Blade main before something like the S8 Skydance boon existed. It basically took the requirement of us either needing a Techer or requiring a specific ring on at all times down to basically just having that free completely because of an S8. On top of that, in S6, the S8s and S6s went on units, but on top of that, another augment that basically made it so we were able to get the effect of a specific weapon at all times, no matter what weapon we were using. So these were insanely powerful. And the crazy part about it is as long as you can get a hold of them, they were the easiest thing to augment. They were 100%. So not only were they way easier, they were insanely powerful, and they also changed up how you played the game for specific classes. It across the board, this is why a lot of players would get really upset at other players who didn't augment anything, because it would be crazy to see something like a light weave weapon, where light weave weapons had 5 S-grid augment slots. Basically, you had to slot in each individual slot. The different slots had different augments that could go into them. At S1 through S5, we would see weapons that would have a light weave weapon that had an S1, S2, S3, S4, and S5 with an S3 in it, and then nothing else. Like, these were free. They could not get any easier to augment. That's when you would upset a player. Like, that would be ridiculous, because that's like, you made zero effort whatsoever. It wasn't even a situation of you couldn't afford it. There were even super weak, not amazingly useful augments you could slot in there as like placeholders to give you some sort of benefit. So yeah, these were super, super powerful and a good time. I would love to see something like this come back, but I think it's too early.
The lack of a better word, sterile. Even weapon elements were relegated to a gimmick only a few weapon series interact with. Because of that, they never provide a big enough advantage to justify making multiple elemental weapons to deal with different enemies. Like, do you really want me to invest in a weapon that has a light element attached to it, and performs only marginally better against a handful of enemies than the identical elementless version?
So here's the thing, right? I'm not sure what formula or what chart they were using for this comparison, but I'm gonna try to break down what this is actually trying to show. So we've done these on the channel beforehand, where we use Cakewalk's spreadsheet to show comparisons of weapons, right? And there are certain circumstances being higher damage versus lower damage. A few things to keep in mind: that yes, elemental weapons only offered a marginal increase in damage. The reason why a lot of elemental weapons were used was, one, the ease of use of gathering set elemental weapons versus the other option. So for example, a Neos Astrian was unpurchasable. You had to get it as a drop. You had to get lucky enough to get the one that you needed as a drop for your class, or get 5 drops, then turn into a currency, turn into your weapon itself. So, and then getting this within Fixa was even more difficult, because you had to get the proper weapon to drop for you in the first place with a good Fixa, because you couldn't purchase it or sell it. Or you could just buy a Justitian. See where things kind of differ here? Justitians just dropped and they work like every other weapon, so it wasn't a situation of like, is it worth it because it's more damage? It was just easier to get. And at a certain point, for a while, if you got a Justitian, I think at Fixa level 3 Fatale, it was already stronger than an Astrian. Until potential level 6 came out, where potential level 6, because of the way Astrian's potential worked and provided more potency overall, it was actually stronger than a Justitian on a light weak target. So as you can see, this is Justitian plus, right? I'm not sure if they're doing this comparatively for a light weak target or how this is being set up, but an Astrian at 0 level Fixa versus a Justitian at 0 level Fixa is stronger on a light weak target. So this is where knowing your balances of how your weapons work and the potencies work does matter. So yes, definitely the case, but a lot of times most people were just going with whatever the ease of use weapon was to get a hold of, because of, 1, Fixa levels, and 2, RNG protection.
Elementless version? Elemental weapons are honestly very underwhelming in general. In PSO2, weapon elements were just another weapon customization mechanic. Matching elemental weakness boosted your weapon stats, causing a roughly 3 to 5% damage increase. It differed from enemy to enemy, some even punished you for using the wrong element due to their resistances, but in
There were 2 enemies, maybe 3, that punished you for using the wrong elemental resistance. They just become immune to it. Also, in all of base PSO2, you only used light. There was some arguments for certain other weapons to be used, depending upon, I believe it depended upon the episode we were in episode 4, wind was used a lot. And then moving in episode 5, dark got used a little bit as well. But 90% of people use light because 90% of enemies that you would fought that mattered against them were weak to light. So you didn't really worry too much about having other elements available to you all the time. If you did, and you had made multiple weapons, it was for very, very niche classes. For example, the Soaring Blade Bouncer back in episode 4 and 5, where back on JP you would use Elemental Stance. Elemental Stance required the proper element for the proper weapons. A lot of times elements or enemies would mix together in AoE situations, being weak to different elements, so you used light because most of the time that covered almost everything you needed it to. Outside of that, you weren't really worried about it, so not really, no, didn't really have that much of an impact.
Ultra hard difficulty, it was normalized to roughly 3%. In NGS, that damage boost is still in place. Matching the elemental weakness amplifies the damage by 15%, and mismatching only gives a 10% boost. The problem is that the weapon attack stat is lowered to compensate for this boost, and because of that, elemental weapons often don't perform better than their elementless counterparts.
Keep in mind, it's not lowered just because of the difference, or just to compensate for that boost. It's lowered to compensate for that boost, and to compensate for the fact that you're going to be able to apply elemental downs using that weapon without having to do anything extra.
Honestly, that wasn't a good trade. It just made elemental weapons feel really bad outside of extreme min-maxing situations.
Also, they were extraordinarily easy to get a hold of at high fixes because they usually drop with events, so.
Like clearing a purple trigger by yourself. Elemental weapons give you access to elemental downs, even on non-technique classes.
Yep.
That's why they're useful in those min-max cases, but the system overall feels like a downgrade to me. We're basically at SEGA's mercy to get new elemental weapons.
That is
If
true.
you're a wand lover like me, you'll notice that after 2 years, there is still not a single wind element wand in the game. What's up with that?
Why do you need a wind element wand as a techer? Techers can apply their own elements to their weapons. It doesn't matter. You don't have to actually get a weapon like that. You have the thing. You can do the thing. You can do the thing. It doesn't matter.
A loot overhaul has been my biggest wish for the version 2 update.
Same,
I won't be
honestly.
terribly disappointed if it won't happen. I just think this kind of rebranding is the perfect opportunity to pull something like this off. I guess we will have to tune in to the NGS headline on Tuesday to see if there are any plans for that. I really hope the devs acknowledge these issues and have something planned to address them. Maybe that's why they're so secretive about the contents of the version 2 update, and why the Renaisa weapon series is being replaced by a new one.
I actually did not know this until I watched this video.
Or maybe I'm just overdosing on hopium. Anyway, I'd like to hear your thoughts on the matter. Am I overthinking it, or am I onto something? I really think NGS would have been a better game if the loot was more interesting again. Anyway, I hope you'll have a fantastic day, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care!
Okay, so overall, pretty solid video. Again, things I disagree with, but that's totally fine. A lot of players have this mindset when it comes to loot in NGS. It is not a new concept for people to be like, well, the rewards aren't worth it, so I'm not going to spend my time there. And I totally agree. A lot of cases, the rewards just aren't worth it. However, that's nothing new. Here's the thing. Looting hasn't changed since base PSO2, and I'm gonna explain to you guys how it's very much almost exactly the same. The only thing that's been removed and the biggest impact has been the separation of augments from weapons and units. How you interacted with them, when it boiled down to it, it was almost one for one the same thing. NGS just removed the middleman. So let's go through what happens in NGS and let's go with what happens in base PSO2. So, and I say base PSO2, people call it classic, whatever you want to call it, that's totally fine. So let's assume that you got a bunch of drops, right? You finished an urgent quest in NGS, right? Let's say we could finish urgent quest in NGS. You got a bunch of drops, you got some weapons, nothing has a fixer or whatever, nothing really great, right? Just a bunch of stuff, not really all that great. Let's say you have material storage, you can just throw all your capsules into material storage immediately. Pretty easy, pretty simple. Everything else, if it's not anything useful, no cosmetics, it's just vendored, you get some Meseta, you move on. Cool, that's NGS in a nutshell. That's pretty much the entire urgent quest system. It's not fantastic by any means. It does suck when you don't really get anything worth it, but when you do get those big ticket items, right, you get the proper weapon, you get the proper fixa, you get the cosmetic that's worth a bunch of money, that's when it pops off. That's awesome, right? Or you see you get like a ticket for this special scratch or whatever because it's during an event or something, right? And that's when it pops off. Let's move over to a classic or base PSO2. What happens there? So the looting system, in most cases, what you're looking at when we finish an urgent quest, you go into the urgent quest, you pop a 250% rare drop rate boost. That's very important because you want to make sure you have as much rare drop rate as possible. Make sure you get the most 10-star and over weapons as possible. So at the end of the mission, what happens is you get some Meseta, which is usually almost throwaway amounts. I don't think I've ever been in a situation where I've paid attention to my Meseta drops at all in classic PSO2. In NGS, yes, because we have the auto sell feature on, and we can get quite a bit of Meseta just from farming. But in base PSO2 or in classic, raw Meseta drops were not fantastic. Outside of like very specific and niche enemies that you would hit that could spawn a bunch of Meseta, like certain rare enemies that would spawn, it really wasn't anything that you would pay any attention to. So what you were looking for was anything over 10 star. You would pick up everything that was over 10 star. Now this is in case you didn't see anything that could possibly be worth money. For example, let's say the urgent quest you're doing, there is an augment that's worth money on a unit that drops or on a weapon that drops. Then you're looking around for everything that's on the ground that's over 10 star and that's also over the number of augment slots that you need. Usually a 1 or 2 star augment slot's not going to be really worth much unless it's a very, very rare augment that you're definitely going for. You want to make sure you pick up everything, then look for that augment. Or you're looking for something that's like 4 to 5 slots, maybe 6 slots, and you're just walking over random weapons and units to see if you have anything that fits that category. Now let's say you don't, nothing really drops, and you don't see anything there. You're picking up all your 10 stars, weapons, units, all that stuff, and then you're leaving. So you finish the quest, what are you doing next? Now you're headed over to the shop area. In the shop area, you are but you're appraising all of the weapons and units that dropped, because in base PSO2 there was an appraisal system where you had to appraise weapons and units to be able to then do anything with them. You appraised all the weapons and units. It cost you some Meseta, so you weren't really akin to appraise them unless you knew you were going to do something with them, which is why you usually only picked up things that were over 10 stars. Anything below it, you didn't really worry too much about, because then you would end up spending Meseta in the cost of the appraisal system. You'd appraise everything, right? See if there's anything that's worth its salt. If there was nothing, you would then take everything and turn it into either X cubes or photon spheres. X cubes were more useful, photon spheres were used on the side, but you would take those photon spheres and you would do one of 3 things with them. You would either buy more rare drop rate chance, because you want to make sure you had one up for every single mission, which I think cost like 6 X cubes. So as long as you made at least 6 X cubes worth of weapons, it was definitely worth it, because the rare drop rate was worth 30 minutes. And you definitely got more than 30 minutes out of it. Or you definitely got more than 6 out of it in 30 minutes. You would then either use the X cubes for a augmentation increase. So augment success chance increases if you're someone who augmented your own gear. I think it was 100 X cubes for like a 40%. So they were pretty expensive. You didn't need a lot of them if you're augmenting your own gear. So there was that. Or if you didn't need it for either of those reasons, you would turn them into end grinders, and then guess what you do with the you turn them into grinders, and then guess what you do with the grinders? You vendor them. So your weapons turn into Meseta. It's the exact same process. They just cut out the middleman. There's no rare drop rate you need to have up all the time. The rare drop rate they have, in my opinion, is worse than NGS. The rare drop rate is lower, but on top of that, RDR has always been a trap anyway. The higher values in base PSO2 just made it seem like you had so much more that you were gaining, but realistically only really mattered when it came to XP. And the XP values were so much higher in classic PSO2, so having those higher values was kind of nice. But rare drop rate was a trap in my opinion. It didn't really do anything outside of feed you X cubes and then feed you more rare drop rates to then feed you Meseta. In base PSO2, they just cut out the X cube portion of it. You're not cubing anything. It just directly turns into Meseta. You don't have to worry about going to a vendor. You don't have to worry about going through a bunch of time of exchanging X cubes into grinders and then eventually selling all of them. For those of you who played back in base PSO2, you know of the pains of exchanging X cubes for grinders. People wrote macros to do it, or you would sit and watch a TV show and you had the number of inputs memorized and did it exactly in that order. You had to compensate for lag and put stuff away. It was a nightmare. So basically the same system, the same things you did, minus a few minor details, just got you the same result, Meseta. So realistically, the system, exactly the same. You just cut out all of the extra fluff. No walking to appraise items, no X cubing, no taking those X cubes, turning them into, end grinder, or turning them into grinders, and taking those grinders and turning them into Meseta. You just took the weapons that weren't worth anything, turned them directly into Meseta. Granted, it's a lot less now, because Meseta is worth more in NGS than it is in base PSO2. In base PSO2, I want to say like the average amount of Meseta was like, I want to say maybe it was like a 10-to-1 ratio. Now it's more of like 100 mil to 1 ratio versus NGS and base PSO2 because of Cradle causing so much inflation in base game. But the actual system for going through all of this is virtually the same. So yeah, I do definitely want to see a new system implemented for looting and things like that. I would love to see it be a bit more interesting, but there's an asterisk involved. It can't be so complicated that looting becomes a chore and an irritation. The thing about it is a lot of people don't do Cradle, or a lot of people when they look at doing Cradle are terrified of doing Cradle because they're going to be playing inventory wars. And inventory wars is not fun. Having to sort through tons and tons of loot all the time consistently because loot's being thrown in your inventory all over and over and over and over again is not a fun time. It just interrupts fun gameplay. If you're enjoying the game, the last thing you want to do is to stop playing the game to then do your chores so that you can go back to playing the game again. So I hope it does definitely see a bit of an iteration change. Maybe not a full rework, not a full rebalance, but an iteration change to make it be a bit more interesting, increase some drop rates, introduce some cosmetics, give us a reason to pay a bit more attention to loot itself, which they're trending a bit more towards. They are doing a better job of that, but please do not backtrack. The last thing we need is to get a ton of extra stuff to rebalance things and shake up the meta for like a week or two for it to fall into the exact same thing with just more tedium involved. So let me know what you guys think in the comments below. Like I said, this video is going to be insanely long. It's what, 42 minutes now at this point? Jesus. Apologies for any of you guys who stuck it through all the way to the end. I appreciate you guys. You guys are the real ones. Let me know how you guys feel. I know I'm going to have tons of comments of just paragraphs of information. Whether you agree or disagree is totally fine. Just be respectful to one another. That's all I ask. I'm not going to tolerate anything less. Anyway, guys, like if you enjoyed the video, subscribe if you want to keep up with more. I'll see you all next time. Take care, everyone. Peace out.